In February of 1989, a county inspector nailed a bright orange notice to the door of a stone silo on George Hansen's farm. The order was simple: condemn and demolish. The structure was a hazard. It was coming down. George read the notice, took it off the door, and filed it in his kitchen drawer. Then he did something the county never expected. He decided to keep it standing for 35 years. The silo was a crumbling relic from the 1880s, and the county had the law on its side. But George saw what they didn't: not a hazard, but a handmade monument to a forgotten way of farm life. This is the story of a 35-year standoff between one stubborn farmer and the entire weight of county government, and the quiet patience that turned a condemnation order into a historical plaque. George Hansen was 54 years old in 1989. He had farmed these 200 acres his entire life, inheriting them from his father, who inherited them from his. The stone silo wasn't just on the property, it was part of the family story. His grandfather had helped build it in the 1880s, using fieldstone cleared from these very pastures, mortar mixed from sand dug from the creek bank. It was never just a storage building. It was the first permanent improvement on what was then a raw, wooded homestead, a statement that the Hansens were here to stay. The county inspector saw it differently. His name was Bill Corrigan. He worked for the Seneca County Department of Public Works Code Enforcement Division. His job was simple: identify unsafe structures and remove them. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't a preservationist. He was a man with a clipboard, a camera, and a section of the New York State Property Maintenance Code that gave him authority. In the winter of '88, a neighbor had called in a complaint. Said the old silo looked like it might fall over. Said it was an eyesore and a danger. Corrigan visited in January. The farm was quiet midwinter. He took photographs. He noted the obvious: mortar erosion on the north face, a slight visible lean, several stones near the base that had shifted outward. He didn't consult a structural engineer. He didn't call the State Historic Preservation Office. He followed his protocol. He wrote up a violation notice citing sections 304 and 305 of the code: failure to maintain exterior walls in sound condition, and failure to correct unsafe structural conditions. He recommended condemnation and demolition. It was, to him, a straightforward case. The silo itself was what farmers called a potato barn design. In the late 19th century, before round tower silos made of steel or concrete became standard, farmers in upstate New York and New England built these stone cylinders. They were double-walled, with an air gap for insulation, perfect for storing root crops through the frozen winter. They were marvels of pre-industrial engineering, built without blueprints, relying on the skill of the mason to lay each irregular stone so the whole cylinder held its shape. By 1989, they were almost extinct. Most had been torn down or had simply collapsed from neglect. George's was one of the last. But to the county, its history was irrelevant. The law Corrigan operated under had no clause for architectural significance. If a structure was deemed unsafe, it was to be made safe or removed. Period. There was no mechanism to balance safety against heritage. This is the legal blind spot where historic buildings often die, a process preservationists call demolition by neglect. A county can order a demolition to abate a hazard, and no other board or commission is required to weigh in. The building inspector's order is final. George received the preliminary notice in the mail. It gave him 30 days to submit a plan for repair or demolition. He drove into town and went to the code's office. He asked to speak with Corrigan. He explained that the silo had stood for over 100 years. It had a slight lean because the ground had settled a century ago, and it hadn't moved an inch in his lifetime. He said he could repoint the mortar. He could brace it if they wanted. Corrigan listened, but his hands were tied by his own report. The violation was documented. The recommendation was made. To reverse it, George would need to hire a licensed professional engineer to conduct a formal assessment and stamp a set of repair drawings. Then he would need to pull a building permit, which would trigger requirements for the entire structure to be brought up to modern code, impossible for an 1880 stone building. The path to saving it was designed to be prohibitively expensive and complex. The path to destroying it was simple: sign the demolition permit. George left the office that day with a clear understanding. This wasn't a conversation about safety. It was a bureaucratic trap. The system was engineered to remove old things, not to understand them. He had a 30-day clock ticking and two options: comply or become a violator. He spent the next month doing something nobody expected. He didn't hire an engineer. Instead, he visited the county record's office. He dug through old deed books and tax maps. He found the original farm survey from 1882. He found receipts in his grandfather's trunk for the lime and sand purchased for the mortar. He took his own photographs, documenting every angle of the silo, showing the robust interior, the still solid oak beam framing under the roof. He wrote a 3-page letter, not to the code's office, but to the county historian, a woman named Eleanor Vance. He included the documents, the photos, a hand-drawn diagram of the construction. He ended the letter with a question: if we tear this down because some mortar is crumbling, what are we saying about our own history? That it's only worth keeping if it's perfectly convenient. He mailed the letter and waited. The 30-day deadline passed. A week later, the official condemnation order arrived. It was no longer a notice. It was a command. It declared the structure an imminent hazard to public safety. It gave George Hansen 60 days to complete demolition and remove all debris. If he did not comply, the county would contract a demolition crew, do the work itself, and place a lien on his farm for the full cost, plus administrative fees. It was signed by the Commissioner of Public Works. The bright orange notice that would be nailed to the silo door was attached as a copy. George read it at his kitchen table, the same table where his grandfather had once planned the silo's construction. He folded the letter neatly, placed it in the drawer with the first notice, and walked outside. He looked at the silo, towering 40 feet into the gray winter sky, the stone dark with moisture, the oak roof bleached silver. He made his decision right then. He would not tear it down. He would let them try to make him. But here's what George Hansen didn't know. That letter to the county historian, it had already begun to change everything. Because Eleanor Vance didn't just file it away. She read it, and then she made a phone call. Eleanor Vance called the State Historic Preservation Office in Albany. She didn't ask for help. She asked a question. What happens when a county orders the demolition of a structure that might be eligible for the National Register? The answer was bureaucratic, but it contained a sliver of hope. The state office could not stop a county condemnation order. Code enforcement authority is local, absolute when public safety is cited. But property was listed on or formally determined eligible for the National Register. Any project using federal funds or permits would require a review. A county demolition using only its own money, no review required. The preservation office was essentially powerless, but they made a note. They filed George Hansen's name and the location of the silo in a database of Atrisk resources. It was a footnote in a digital file. For George, it changed nothing. The 60-day clock kept ticking. Spring of 1989 arrived. The deadline for demolition came and went. George did nothing. He farmed around the silo. He planted his corn. He waited. The first response from the county wasn't a bulldozer. It was a fine. A notice of violation arrived, imposing a penalty of $50 per day for every day the condemned structure remained standing. The fines were accruing from the date the condemnation order was issued. By the time George opened the envelope, he already owed over $3,000. He drove back to the code's office. Bill Corrigan was not sympathetic. The order is the order, Mr. Hansen. Demolish the silo, the fines stop. Keep it up, the fines keep adding up. And eventually we will come and tear it down, and you will pay for that too. George asked if he could pay the fines but leave the silo. Corrigan looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. The point of the fine is to compel compliance, not to sell you a permit to keep a hazard. No. So George began writing checks, $50 a day every day. He set up a separate ledger in his farm account book. Line after line, June 1st, $50. June 2nd, $50. It was a bleeding wound in his finances. But to him, it was rent. Rent paid to the county for the right to keep a piece of history on his own land. By the end of that first year, the fines totaled $18,250. George paid it. He sold a few extra calves. He skipped replacing his aging tractor. The money was gone. The silo stood. To the county, it was a simple equation. Financial pressure would eventually break him. They didn't understand that for George, this was no longer about money. It was about principle. It was about who had the right to decide what was valuable. And he started to work, not with permits or engineers, but alone, quietly on Sundays. He bought bags of lime mortar mix, the closest modern equivalent to the original formula. He built a shaky scaffold from old lumber, and he began repointing the north face, the one the inspector had photographed. He used a trowel and a brush, carefully scraping out the soft, eroded mortar and replacing it inch by painful inch. He wasn't trying to make it new. He was trying to make it stable. To remove the safety hazard, argument stone by stone. A neighbor saw him up on the scaffold and called the code's office again. This time, Corrigan came out with the county attorney. They photographed George on his ladder. They issued a new violation, performing unpermitted work on a condemned structure. Another $50 a day fine, stacked on top of the first. George looked down from his scaffold at the two men. He didn't say a word. He just went back to work with his trowel. The attorney later said it was the most defiant silence he'd ever witnessed. Let me tell you about the fifth year, because that's when the personal cost became a physical one. The annual fines had consumed George's savings. He was in his late 50s now, and the manual labor of farming alone was taking its toll. The scaffold work, the hauling of mortar, the constant financial strain, it was aging him. His wife, Mary, who had supported him quietly, finally sat him down at the kitchen table. "George," she said, "they're not going to change their minds. This is breaking us. Not just the bank account, us." She wasn't asking him to give up. She was asking him to see what it was doing to them. George looked at his hands, calloused and stained with mortar. He looked out the window at the silo. "If I stop now," he said, "then the last 5 years were just a waste of money. If I keep going, at least I'm buying time. Time for something to change." What changed was the arrival of the internet. In the late 90s, Eleanor Vance, the county historian, retired. But before she left, she digitized her files. She included George's letter, his photos, and her correspondence with the state. She uploaded it to a nascent statewide heritage network. In 2001, a graduate student in historic preservation at Cornell, researching vernacular agricultural structures, found the file. Her name was Claire Rossi. She saw the photos of the double-walled stone construction. She read the description, potato barn silo, and she knew she was looking at something rare. Claire drove to Seneca County. She knocked on George Hanson's door. He was 66 now, wary of strangers. She showed him her university ID. She said, "I think your silo is incredibly important." George, who had spent 12 years being told it was worthless and dangerous, just stared at her. He didn't trust her. He thought she might be from the county, trying a new tactic. It took an hour of talking on his porch before he let her walk up to it. Claire spent the afternoon with a tape measure, a camera, and a notebook. She examined the mortar joints George had repaired. She noted the oak pegs holding the beam ends. She sketched the construction technique. When she was done, she was certain. This was not just an old silo. It was a nearly pristine example of a specific, regional adaptation in agricultural technology, a missing link between early underground storage pits and the modern tower silo. Its significance wasn't just local, it was national. She went back to Cornell and wrote a 20-page preliminary assessment. She argued that the Seneca County silo met multiple criteria for the National Register of Historic Places. It embodied the distinctive characteristics of a type of construction. It yielded information important to history. It was associated with the broad patterns of agricultural development in the Northeast. She sent copies to the State Preservation Office. to every historical society in the region, and to George Hansen. George read her report slowly, looking up the big words in a dictionary. When he finished, he put it in the kitchen drawer with the condemnation orders. The report was powerful, but it was just paper. The county's orders were paper too, backed by the force of law. One paper did not cancel out the other. The fines, now over $150,000, kept accruing. But Claire's paper started a ripple. A local newspaper, the Seneca Falls Chronicle did a story. Farmer fights county to save historic silo. For the first time, the public narrative shifted. It was no longer just a stubborn farmer ignoring safety rules. It was a David and Goliath story about preservation. Letters to the editor poured in. Some called George a fool. Many called him a hero. The county board of supervisors started getting phone calls. Bill Corrigan, now the head of code enforcement, was furious. The publicity was making his department look like the villain. He requested an emergency hearing before the county board. He brought his original photos, the engineering opinion he'd finally gotten that said the lien was a potential failure point, and a simple, powerful argument. This structure is unsafe. My job is to protect the public. Every day it stands, we are liable if it collapses and hurts someone. Sentiment and history do not override the building code. We must enforce the law. The board, feeling political heat, came up with a compromise. They voted to suspend the accrual of further fines if George would agree to a county-supervised demolition. It was presented as an act of mercy, a way out. George was invited to the board meeting to hear the offer. He stood before them, an old man in clean overalls. He listened politely. Then he said, "You're offering to stop charging me rent for my own property if I agree to destroy the thing I'm paying rent to keep. That's not a compromise, that's a surrender." He turned to Bill Corrigan. "You say it's unsafe. I've repointed every stone on the weak side. I've monitored that lien with a plumb line for 15 years. It hasn't moved. Where is the imminent danger? Is it in the building, or is it in your file?" The room was silent. The board chairman asked if he had any professional assessment to counter the counties. George said, "I have 15 years of daily observation, and I have this." He held up Claire Rossi's preliminary assessment. "This says it's historically priceless. Your report says it's worthless. One of these papers is wrong, but only one of them is trying to erase the evidence forever." The board did not change its position. The offer stood: demolish and the debt goes away. George refused. The fines, though suspended from growing, remained on the books as a lien against his farm. The standoff hardened into a permanent state of Cold War. And then in 2008, after 19 years of struggle, the county made its decisive move. They weren't sending letters anymore. They were sending a sheriff's deputy. The deputy served George with a court order. It wasn't another fine. It was a summons to appear before a county judge for a hearing to enforce the demolition order through contempt of court. If the judge ruled against him, George could be ordered to demolish the silo immediately. If he still refused, he could be found in contempt and face actual jail time. The county had decided to play its final card, the full coercive power of the judicial system. George was 73 years old. He showed the summons to Mary. They didn't have money for a lawyer. The accumulated lien for the old fines was over $200,000, a monstrous number hanging over the deed to their farm. Claire Rossi, the graduate student now working for a preservation nonprofit, heard about the hearing. She called George. "We can't let this happen," she said. She connected him with a lawyer, Marcus Thorne, who took the case pro bono. Thorne specialized in property rights and had tangled with overzealous code enforcement before. The hearing was in a cramped county courtroom. On one side, Bill Corrigan, the county attorney, and a structural engineer they'd hired to testify. On the other, George, Mary, and Marcus Thorne. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Walsh, had read the file. She understood this was about more than a building. The county's argument was straightforward. They presented the original condemnation, the unheeded orders, the fines, the engineer's report stating the risk of progressive collapse. They argued that George's ongoing refusal was a flagrant disrespect for the law and a genuine public safety concern. They asked the judge to order immediate compliance and to impose additional daily fines until the demolition was complete. Then Marcus Thorne stood up. He didn't argue about safety first. He started with history. He entered Claire Rossi's preliminary assessment into evidence. He called her as a witness. She explained in clear terms the national significance of the structure. She presented photographs of other, similar silos that had been lost. She stated that George Hanson's silo was, in her professional opinion, potentially the best preserved example of its kind in the northeastern United States. Judge Walsh interrupted. "Ms. Rossi, this is fascinating, but this court's purview is code enforcement. Is the structure safe or isn't it?" Thorne stepped back in. "Your Honor, that's the critical question. The county says it is unsafe based on a single inspection 19 years ago and a follow-up review that looked only at the original defects. My client has spent those 19 years maintaining it. He has repointed the mortar. He has monitored its stability. The county has not inspected it since. They are seeking to destroy a potentially nationally significant historic resource based on evidence that is 2 decades stale. That is not responsible enforcement. That is institutional inertia." Then Thorne played his riskiest card. He called George to the stand. He had George describe, step by step, the maintenance he performed every year. The plumb line checks, the mortar work, the drainage he kept clear around the base. Then he asked the question everyone was thinking. "Mr. Hanson, why? After 19 years of fines and conflict, why not just give in?" George looked at the judge, then at Bill Corrigan. "Because in 1989 they told me it was worthless. They told me it was just a hazard, but my grandfather helped build it. It's the last thing on this farm he touched with his own hands. It's not worthless to me. And when that young lady," he pointed to Claire, "told me it might be important to history too, that just confirmed what I already felt. You can't replace something like that. Once it's gone forever. The county can always spend money. It can't make another 1880s stone silo." The county attorney objected. "Emotional appeal, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Walsh said, but she had listened. Then came the pivotal exchange. Thorne called the county's own engineer, a man named Dr. Alastair Reed, back to the stand for cross-examination. "Dr. Reed," Thorne began, "your report cites a progressive risk of collapse. Can you quantify that risk? What is the annual probability of failure?" Reed shifted in his seat. "It's not a precise statistical calculation. It's a professional judgment based on the observed deterioration. Based on observations made in 1989 and 2003, correct?" "Correct." "And you have not inspected the north-facing mortar joints that Mr. Hanson repaired?" "I have not." "So your assessment of imminent hazard does not account for the remedial work performed over the last 2 decades. The work was unpermitted and not performed to code by a licensed mason. It doesn't change the fundamental structural concerns." Thorne picked up a photograph. "This is a picture of the county courthouse we're sitting in, built in 1895. Its stone foundation has been repointed numerous times over the years, often without permits, by county maintenance staff. Is the courthouse an imminent hazard?" "Objection," the county attorney shouted. "Withdrawn," Thorne said smoothly. He had made his point. The standards being applied to George's silo were not applied evenly across the county's own historic infrastructure. Judge Walsh took the matter under advisement. For 2 weeks, George and Mary waited. The tension was unbearable. The local paper ran daily stories. A small group of preservationists held a vigil outside the courthouse. The national nonprofit, the Historic Farmsteads Trust, issued a statement supporting George. The judge's ruling landed like a thunderclap. She found in favor of the county on the core legal issue. The condemnation order was validly issued and had not been complied with. However, she denied the request for an immediate demolition order. Instead, she imposed a new, staggering fine of $1,000 per day, retroactive to the date of the hearing, until George provided a solution acceptable to the county. But and this was the critical twist, she defined acceptable solution as either demolition, or a certified rehabilitation plan prepared by a professional engineer and historian, and approved by both the Code Office and the State Historic Preservation Office. She gave him 1 year to produce this plan. If he failed, the court would grant the demolition order, and he would be liable for the entire mountain of fines, now growing at $1,000 a day. It was a Solomonic judgment. She had given the county its legal win, but she had also, for the first time, created a formal pathway for the silo to be saved through preservation. She had forced the two warring sides, code enforcement and historic preservation, to sit at the same table. Bill Corrigan was furious. He saw it as the judge rewriting his authority. George was exhausted. $1,000 a day was financial ruin, and he now had to fund a professional engineering and historic study, which could cost tens of thousands of dollars. But Claire Rossi saw it as a miracle. The judge had handed them a blueprint. They had 1 year. They needed an engineer, a historian, and a lot of money they didn't have. This is when the story went from a local dispute to a national cause. A documentary filmmaker from New York City, who had been following the case, released a short film online titled The Last Stone Silo. It went viral in preservation and agricultural circles. Donations started trickling into a legal defense fund set up by the Historic Farmsteads Trust. $5 here, $20 there. Then a check for $10,000 arrived from an anonymous donor in California. With the money, Claire and Marcus Thorne assembled a team. They hired a structural engineer, David Chen, who specialized in historic masonry. They hired a noted architectural historian, Dr. Arlene Price, to prepare the formal National Register nomination. The clock was ticking. The $1,000 a day fine was a sword hanging over everything. David Chen's inspection in the spring of 2009 changed the factual foundation of the entire fight. After 2 days of thorough examination, using plumb bobs, laser levels, and a borescope to look inside the wall cavity, he presented his findings. The lean was not a sign of failure. It was built in. The silo had been constructed with a deliberate 2-degree batter, a slight inward slope on its north side to counteract prevailing winds, a technique used by early masons. The mortar repairs George had done were crude but effective. They had stabilized the wall. His conclusion, with a professionally supervised repointing of the lower third and the installation of 3 inconspicuous stainless steel tie rods hidden in the mortar joints, the silo would be stable for another century. It was not an imminent hazard. It was a sound, repairable structure. Bill Corrigan rejected the report. He said Chen was a hired gun for the preservationists. He insisted only a county-approved engineer's opinion mattered. The bureaucratic wall was still standing. Meanwhile, Dr. Arlene Price completed her deep dive into the silo's history. She discovered construction diaries from a neighboring farm that mentioned the Hanson brothers' newfangled stone silo in 1884. She found advertisements in old agricultural journals for patent stone silo plans. She connected George's silo to a specific moment of agricultural experimentation in the 1880s, when farmers were transitioning from wooden to permanent masonry storage. Her nomination draft was powerful. It argued that the silo was not just old, it was a key physical document in the story of American agricultural innovation. The 1-year deadline was 3 months away. They had the engineering solution. They had the historical documentation. They had the money to do the repairs. But they lacked one thing: the county's approval. Bill Corrigan's department was stonewalling, demanding endless revisions and additional tests. It was clear they were running out the clock, waiting for the year to expire so the demolition order could finally be executed. With 90 days left, Marcus Thorne made a desperate, aggressive move. He filed a federal lawsuit, not against the county for the demolition order, but against the county for violating the National Historic Preservation Act. The argument was novel, by refusing to consider the engineering and historical data, and by deliberately obstructing the preservation pathway created by the judge. The county was causing irreparable harm to a property eligible for the National Register. He sought an injunction to stop any demolition until the National Register nomination process could be completed. It was a long shot. Federal courts rarely intervene in local code enforcement, but the filing generated a new wave of media attention. This was no longer just a story about a farmer. It was a story about systemic failure, about how the laws meant to keep us safe can also be used to erase our history. The County Board of Supervisors, facing depositions and national negative press, panicked. They called an emergency closed-door meeting. Bill Corrigan argued to fight, but the county attorney, looking at the legal bills piling up and the terrible optics, advised a settlement. The board was split. With 48 hours left before the judge's one-year deadline, the phone rang in George Hansen's farmhouse. It was Marcus Thorne. His voice was tense, but it held a note of something George hadn't heard in 20 years: hope. The county offered a deal. They would drop all fines, past and present. They would void the condemnation order. They would support the National Register nomination. In return, George had to agree to complete the engineer's stabilization plan within 18 months and grant the county a permanent preservation easement, ensuring the silo could never be torn down without a public hearing. It was a complete surrender by the county on every point that mattered. The $200,000 lien vanished. The daily fines stopped. The threat of demolition was replaced with a promise of protection. George listened to Marcus Thorne explain the terms. He asked one question: "Can I do the work myself under the engineer's direction?" Thorne checked. The county said yes. George signed. The stabilization work began in the spring of 2010. David Chen, the engineer, came out with diagrams and specifications. George, now 75, worked alongside a professional mason Chen brought in. They installed 3 stainless steel tie rods, threading them through the stonework at strategic points, anchoring them deep into the stable core. They repointed the entire lower third with a custom lime-based mortar mix, matching the original. It took 6 weeks. The cost was $38,000, paid for by the donated legal defense fund. When it was done, David Chen signed and stamped a letter certifying the silo was structurally sound and posed no safety hazard. Bill Corrigan, now months from retirement, came to inspect. He walked around it, tapped the new mortar with a knife, and said nothing. He signed the county's certificate of compliance. The war was over. With the legal obstacles cleared, the National Register nomination moved forward swiftly. Dr. Arlene Price's thorough documentation made the case undeniable. In September of 2011, the New York State Board for Historic Preservation unanimously recommended the Hansen Farm stone silo for listing. In March of 2012, the keeper of the National Register in Washington, D.C. approved it. The silo was officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places. A formal certificate arrived in the mail. George framed it and hung it in his kitchen, right next to the drawer that still held the original condemnation order. A small ceremony was held at the farm that June. The county historian, the mayor, representatives from the State Preservation Office, and about 50 neighbors and supporters gathered. A young woman from the state office presented George with a bronze plaque, the official National Register marker. She asked if he wanted to say a few words. George, never a public speaker, looked out at the crowd, at the silo standing solid in the afternoon sun, at Mary smiling beside him. He said, "It's just a building. But it's our building, and now it's everyone's building. Thank you for helping me keep it." They mounted the plaque on the stone at waist height, right where the orange condemnation notice had been nailed 23 years before. Let me tell you about the aftermath, because the story doesn't end with a plaque. Bill Corrigan retired 6 months after signing the compliance certificate. In an interview with the local paper years later, he admitted he'd been wrong, not about the law, but about the purpose of his job. "I saw my job as removing problems. George Hansen saw his job as preserving a legacy. We were talking past each other for 2 decades. The law gave me the power to order the demolition. It didn't give me the wisdom to know when not to use that power. The county codes office, prompted by the lawsuit and the public pressure, adopted a new policy. Any condemnation order for a structure built before 1940 now triggers an automatic review by the county historian's office. It's not a veto, but it's a pause, a chance for history to have a seat at the table. Claire Rossi went on to become a leading advocate for agricultural preservation. She used the Hansen case as a model, showing how technical engineering and historical research could partner to save seemingly lost causes. David Chen, the engineer, found a new niche specializing in the stabilization of historic farm structures, his phone ringing with calls from across the region. And George, he farmed for a few more years, finally retiring at 80. He and Mary still live in the farmhouse. His grandson helps run the operation now. The silo stands empty, a monument more than a tool. But on the first Saturday of every June, George walks out to it. He puts his hand on the stone, feeling the sun-warmed rock and the cool bronze of the plaque. He checks the mortar out of habit. It's all holding. There's a final, quiet detail that brings the story full circle. The preservation easement George granted to the county wasn't just a legal document. It contained a clause he insisted on. It requires that a copy of the original 1989 condemnation order be kept on file with the easement, attached as an exhibit, forever. So anyone who reads the easement in the future, who sees the promises to preserve, will also see the order that demanded destruction. One piece of paper justifying the other, a permanent record of the conflict that saved the thing it tried to erase. So what did 35 years of patience actually buy? It bought back $200,000 in fines. It bought a line in a national register. It bought a change in county law. But for George Hansen, it bought something simpler. It bought the right to be right. The right to look at a stone cylinder built by his grandfather and say, "This matters," and to have the world eventually agree with him. The county called it a hazard. History called it a treasure. And one stubborn farmer, by simply outlasting everyone else, made sure the second opinion was the one that stuck. The story of George Hansen's silo is a map of two different kinds of time. There is bureaucratic time, the 60-day deadline, the annual fine, the one-year court ultimatum. It is quick, rigid, and designed for compliance. Then there is historical time, the century a stone wall stands, the decades of patient maintenance, the 35 years it takes for a culture to reconsider what it has labeled worthless. George lived in both, but he bet on the second one, and he won. We live in a world built for bureaucratic time. We are governed by efficiency, by immediate risk assessment, by the bottom line. We tear down the old to make way for the new because it is faster, cheaper, easier. We call it progress. But this story asks us to consider the cost of that speed. What do we lose when we empower systems to erase anything that doesn't fit their narrow definition of utility? What histories are buried in the rubble of what we call hazards? George Hansen's victory was not just personal. It was a proof of concept. It proved that the relentless forward march of code enforcement can be met with the equally powerful force of stubborn, informed patience. It proved that a single person, armed with nothing but a trowel and a deep sense of legacy, can outlast an entire county government. But it also required a village, a historian who listened, a student who researched, a lawyer who fought, an engineer who measured, and strangers who donated. It was a victory of collective memory over institutional forgetfulness. So let me leave you with this question. Look around your own town, your own street. What is the stone silo in your world? What is that overlooked structure, that fatting piece of craftsmanship, that bit of local history that someone in an office somewhere has deemed obsolete, unsafe, or not worth the trouble? It might be a barn, a bridge, a theater, a tree. It is the thing that, if it disappears, will take a piece of your community's soul with it. Who is going to stand in front of it with a trowel and a ledger and say, "No, not this one"? The fight is never just about bricks and mortar. It is about what we value, what we remember, and what kind of ancestors we choose to be. George Hansen chose to be the kind who passed on a stone silo with a bronze plaque instead of an empty field with a lien. The choice is always there. The clock is always ticking. What will you do with your 35 years? Thank you for watching. If you found this story of patience and preservation meaningful, consider subscribing. There are countless other tales of quiet defiance waiting to be told, and we share them here every week.